Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was a gamer between dimensions. When a boy wakes up in the world of Naruto with no memory of the past, foggy memories of the future, and a convenient gamer-like ability, so what's he to do? The only option is to get stronger and move forward. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard! Chapter 18. I took a deep breath in and exhaled. With my eyes opened and my mind sharp, I sent my chakra beneath the ground and spread it out. Next, I magnetized the granular mineral I had been searching for before pulling. I felt a tug with my chakra before a glitter of gold dust erupted from the earth. Immediately after, my hold slipped. The minuscule amount of gold dust crumpled to the ground and lay there while I stood above it in thought. As I thought, it's much too difficult to control such fine particles. It's like trying to control every single grain individually. I would need a much faster processing capability in order to achieve that effect as I am now. With the rate that I was improving, even with clones, it would take years for me to tweak and improve upon my Sunagakure-style magnet release enough that it would be combat applicable. It made sense considering that it had taken the Sand Village decades of trial and error to create this style and ingrain it into their DNA. I lowered my arms with a sigh. I knew that some bloodlines had a strong biological component, but I had been hoping that I would be able to create my own soon enough. As reality dictated, nothing worth having come easy, and considering the fact that many villages, Konoha included, had spent many more years developing their own bloodline limits than I had been alive, it stood to reason that I wouldn't be able to perfect it so quickly or easily. I had an idea of what was wrong, but in order for me to fix the issue, I would have to induce a mutation upon my own chakra. Wasn't even sure how I would go about doing that, but I did have an idea of someone who would. I guess I can't avoid him forever. With that thought, I stood up. I looked around the empty training ground I had been practicing in and walked away. Let's just get this over with. I already knew where Orochimaru's lab was, so I began my slow and dreary walk over there. If it wasn't painfully clear, I wasn't quite keen on being near the guy. I mean, his emotions were all so weird and just a bit twisted. I could barely understand most of what he was feeling, as it was all an odd jumbled mess of screwed up emotions. I'm just going to take my time getting there. Slow and steady wins the race. Any moment I could put off meeting with him, even if I desperately needed to, was welcome. As my mind delved into those kinds of thoughts, I continued to walk towards the outskirts of the village before I arrived at the Konoha Impervious Detention Facility. There I could sense Orochimaru's chakra signature below. After showing some ID to the guards, I made my way inside the building and walked to the stairs leading down to the building's lower levels. With my hands against the walls, I flared my chakra a little before a tremble sounded out. The wall shifted before slowly opening up, allowing me access to the extra layer within. After making sure everything all clear, I stepped inside with the wall closing up behind me. This area wasn't too much a secret, but only authorized personnel could access it, which only included shinobi of the village. I walked down the long corridor before stopping in front of a steel door near the end of the tunnel. With one more sigh, I knocked. I waited for a moment for a response before the door clicked and opened a crack. And I looked at me through the opening in the door and asked, "Can I help you?" I noted that the voice sounded feminine before replying, "I'm here to see Lord Orochimaru." The eye blinked, "Sensei?" The door was then fully opened, allowing me the full view of the person behind. It was a girl with light brown, pupil-less eyes and violet hair styled in a short, spiky, fan ponytail. She wore a brown-red t-shirt with bracelets, white shorts and fishnet leggings. The girl looked at me up and down before blinking. "What do you want with Sensei?" "He's a little busy at the moment." I looked at her carefully and noted something very important. She was cute. She looked at me blankly for a moment before beaming. "Thanks, you too." And here I was thinking that my charms no longer worked. Though seeing as I spent the majority of my time around people who saw me on a daily basis, it made sense that they wouldn't be as affected. Either that or they just didn't want to give me the satisfaction. I decided to focus on the matter at hand. Yorudan, orphan though you can call me Yoru, I said, sticking out my hand. Anko Mitarashi, also orphan, she said, gripping it with a smile. You can call me the cute and sexy Mistress Anko. My lips twitched before the first part of what she said registered. Orphan. It seems like being cute isn't the only thing we have in common, she stated with that ever-present grin on her face. I think I was beginning to like this girl. Suddenly, a voice from within the room called out. Anko, let the boy in. I've been expecting him for some time. Anko looked between me and Orochimaru before fully opening the door. Welcome in, she said as she stepped to the side. I nodded and entered the room before taking everything in. Monitors covered the sides of the walls, attached to which were tubes that connected to whatever was on the hospital beds below. Cabinets and shelves were littered with vials/beakers containing suspicious fluids, while life-size tubes filled with a green fluorescent fluid contained within them grotesque animals. I gazed at the creatures intently, noting how they seemed to be a fusion of different kinds of animals. Like a chimera. Do those interest you as well? I stopped staring at the messed up animals at the sound of Orochimaru's voice and turned around towards him. A little, but they aren't why I'm here. Orochimaru wore a butcher's apron and a pair of long rubber gloves and had a disturbing smile on his face. I'm quite aware. Do give me a moment. Saying so, he retreated to the corner of his lab and took off his apron and gloves before searching through piles of papers. So, how do you two know each other? I turned to Anko, who was looking at me in intrigue. I gave him something, and as a result, I asked him to help me. Her eyes widened. Oh wait. You're the guy who can make people regrow limbs? She looked at me up and down with a smile. I thought you'd be older, but you're definitely cuter than I had imagined. I raised a brow. What exactly did you imagine? A creepy man who spends all his time studying medicine and chakra in a basement alone with corpses all around as test subjects for his cruel experiments, she said without missing a beat. Wasn't she just basically describing? Here is the information you wanted, Orochimaru said from behind me as he handed me a small pile of papers. I took them before looking at him. Didn't the Hokage tell you not to let anyone know of my identity? I doubt she has enough clearance to know of me. There's no need to be so jumpy, he said with a smile as he walked around me and placed a hand on Anko's head. This little one is with me so the old man wouldn't mind. Besides, she figured it out on her own. I never told her who you were specifically, only that you exist and gave me something. Anko grinned. It wasn't that hard to piece together. I watch you all the time, you know? Looking at those two, I decided not to bother. With that, I opened the report he had written on my genetic material. With my reading speed, I quickly went through the pages of materials, my eyes rapidly shifting from left to right as I read each page. An interesting phenomenon I found about your genetic material, Orochimaru began. I had been testing to see what you were made of on a molecular level, so I had retrieved some DNA samples from your blood and tried to denature their strands. He walked over to a microscope, causing me to turn towards him, and he looked within with a smile. Imagine my surprise when the denatured strands began to adjust to the temperature and rapidly anneal. I had tried to increase the temperature again, but, once more, your DNA quickly stitched itself right back together. He grinned as he adjusted the scope of his microscope. I decided that this time I would start at a much higher temperature than necessary with a fresh sample of your blood. I was wholly prepared for your DNA to be destroyed, and I wasn't surprised when it had, but... His arms trembled with excitement. Who would have thought that your own DNA could heal itself? This wasn't a body part or a damaged cell, but your own DNA reversed the damage that had been done to itself It was fascinating. Do you know what this means? He turned towards me, beaming brightly in glee. If one is able to repair DNA at the cellular level, it's possible to reverse cellular abnormalities and stop not only the progression of skin cancer, but also sun damage, collagen, and elastic damage that causes wrinkles and lines. You would effectively stop aging once your body fully matures, or at least that's my conjecture. I looked at the documents and thought. I had come across that part of his notes already and didn't quite know how to feel, but then again, I couldn't really feel much anyway. But that's not the most interesting thing. Orochimaru stated. Remember the first strand of DNA I talked about? The ones that had rapidly adapted to the intense heat and had re-annealed itself? Well, I wondered if those adaptations could be transferred to fresh DNA samples. I looked back up in interest. Orochimaru's grin furthered. Do you know of bacterial conjugation? I had read a lot of Orochimaru's books on biology, so I nodded my head. Conjugation is like bacterial mating, where two bacteria temporarily join in order to exchange their genetic information. Orochimaru smiled. Correct. Your DNA did something similar when it interacted with fresh samples of your other DNA, except it was obvious very different. I had never seen anything like it. It seemed like biological adaptations that occurred in only a single part of my body could be spread to others. Wait. Was that the reason why whenever I gained strength, my entire body gained strength proportionally? Wait, did that even make sense? I mean, if my body had to adapt to the strain and that adaptation could be passed on, it could make sense of that. Did it have to be the DNA that was passing on those changes? Or did DNA only pass on adaptations about genetic alterations? Maybe my muscle cells could pass on those changes to other parts of my body proportionally, or something. One other thing. Orochimaru said as he moved towards one of the hospital beds and removed the sheets that were covering whatever was underneath. I looked at it intently. It was a body so deformed that its gender could no longer be identified. Despite this, I could see the expression of pain and terror on its warped face. What am I looking at? This one was one of the test subjects I used to see if I could splice your DNA inside of another being dash. I turned towards him with narrowed eyes. You what? Ma, calm down. Orochimaru said with a grin as he pulled the covers up over the corpse. I just wanted to see what your raw DNA would do in a completely foreign environment, but I hadn't quite expected this. He turned towards me. Your genetic material was very prideful, if I had to say. At my raised brow, he continued. When spliced with another person's cells, it immediately tried to take over the host's body and convert it, for lack of a better word, almost as if it found the vessel too weak and unsuitable for its habitation. Unfortunately. Orochimaru glanced back at the hospital bed. This rapid and forced change was too much for the subject's body to handle, and the result was, well, I don't have to explain that. I looked to the bed before asking, and who was that? Don't worry about that bag of flesh. Orochimaru said dismissively, we have plenty of prisoners from the war. I won't be running out of test subject anytime soon. I see. I then continued to read through the information that Orochimaru had given me before I reached near the end. My eyes tightened. I see you like that bit of information I gathered? Orochimaru said as he noticed my expression. I figured that if I couldn't splice your DNA into another person, maybe I could add someone else's genetic information to your own. I glanced up from the papers and looked at him. He grinned. Your DNA chewed up the foreign material and spit out the rest like they were useless scraps. Its chakra signature also slightly mutated towards that of the foreign genetic info if your DNA found it useful. His grin then dulled slightly. Unfortunately, this process seemed to destabilize your genetic information into something less recognizable. If it was to be done on you at this moment, your physical body might change drastically in ways I couldn't understand. I closed my eyes and thought. So, if I wanted to obtain certain bloodlines, I would advise against it for now, nevertheless. Orochimaru took a few steps forward and stood in front of one of the incubation tubes that contained one of the grotesque-looking animals. I might be able to fix that issue in the near future. I turned to look at the tanks as well before commenting. What are those? Did you try to splice my DNA with animals or something? The Sannin chuckled before shaking his head. I would never use your DNA on such base creatures. No, these were actually the remains of an experiment that the third Hokage had deemed forbidden many years ago. Then should you be telling me about it? He shrugged. Consider these reparations for telling my student about you. He then placed his arms to his side and continued. The experiment was on a jutsu called the chimera technique, and judging from the experimental data unearthed from it in addition to the corpses of the mutated beasts, a conclusion was drawn that the technique was meant to combine separate living bodies of organisms into one combined organism bearing the original characteristics of all the organisms, and therefore creating a synthetic body, but... He looked at the tanks seriously. All the data collected also pointed to the conclusion that the creator of this technique could integrate the bodies of others with his own, allowing him to obtain any special traits they possessed, such as Kekei Genkai. I completed. Orochimaru looked at me with a nod and continued, correct. Based on what I have gathered, the user would be able to absorb the bloodlines of others as well as any other physical traits and their chakra. Still. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the green fluorescent glass tanks. The technique is not quite complete. The absorption is not at all stable and could cause serious irreversible changes to the body of the individual in question. They would need to have a very unique body capable of handling these immense alterations, or else they would not be able to digest, for lack of a better term, the absorbed bodies. If not. I looked at the messed up chimera animals and nodded in understanding. I see, the name is quite fitting. It is, isn't it? He stated as he chuckled to himself before continuing, this technique and your own body's genetic makeup could complement each other like two perfectly fitting puzzle pieces. His smile then disappeared, replaced with a gaze of seriousness as he gazed ahead. Who would have thought that Hirako would have it in him to create such a mess? I always took him for such a timid, harmless child. I paused and turned towards him questioningly. You knew the creator of this technique? Yes. You could in fact say we were quite closely acquainted. Orochimaru said with a nod. Unfortunately, some years ago I and my teammates found out that he had been conducting experiments with this technique in secret. Such a thing could have unknown ramifications, so the Hokage has tasked us with bringing him in for questioning. Hirako escaped, leaving his research behind, which the Hokage promptly destroyed. I looked at the tanks placidly. Then these creatures. He resurfaced again during this war and another lab of his was found. This time, the Hokage allowed me to understand what Hirako was trying to accomplish. If this technique was used, it would be quite difficult to defeat under normal circumstances, so I was tasked with finding the weaknesses in it. My glance turned back to Orochimaru, and after all is said and done? The man frowned in displeasure. The concept is actually quite sound, even so, the way Hirako went about it was quite flawed. Too much destabilization could occur to a normal shinobi's body if they tried to absorb the genetic information of multiple individuals. If I was to improve it, I would make it so that I force my information into someone else instead of taking theirs in. Much higher chance of success, especially if all the right conditions are prepared. I glanced at him for a while, causing him to smirk. Don't worry, if anyone tried to take over your body, it would quite literally kill them. It would be like a parasite trying to infect the sun, it would get burned. I turned away and looked the data about my blood. How many copies of this do you have? Only one other. Let's keep it that way then. I said before burning the information I had in hand with a simple application of fire. Don't for a moment let that other one out of your sight. Orochimaru grinned. I wouldn't think about it for the world. You're much too interesting to let out of my sight. I nodded and turned around only to see Anko standing there with a lollipop in her mouth as she glanced between me and Orochimaru with a raised brow. What? I couldn't understand most of what you guys were talking about. I just help him move bodies. Whatever. I thought before heading to the door. if that's all you wanted, I'll be taking my leave. With that, I opened the door slightly. You never did tell me what your second request was? Orochimaru's voice sounded out. I paused and partially turned my head towards him. Once you can figure out how to give me bloodlines without disfiguring or killing me, I'll let you know. Orochimaru's eyes widened before his lips curled upwards. It would be my pleasure. With that, I turned back ahead and walked out the door. Yoru, gamer. Now then, what to do? I thought as I left the prison. A couple of months had gone by since the mission at Kanabi Bridge, and the Third Great Shinobi War was basically over after the peace treaty between Konoha and IWA had been finalized. With that, along with the fact that Suna was our allies, there was no longer a Great Shinobi War, albeit, aggression between Konoha and Kumo along with some interference from Kiri still existed. Even if there was no longer a war, that didn't mean that all the fighting in the world had magically ceased to exist. Though, because there was no longer a war, I had been going on less and less missions. It was fine for a period of time as I had dedicated my newfound free time into training and Fuinjutsu research. Unfortunately, the first one was slow as ever while the second one was a major time sink even with clones. Having multiple clones learn the same thing at the same time did not improve the rate of learning, so there was a requirement for them to dispel periodically. That wouldn't be a problem, except it was a nuisance to deal with when I wanted to leave them to do something while I focused on something. The constant influx of memories from their dispelling daily broke my concentration numerous times and was frustrating since I had to then replenish the clone only for the cycle to repeat itself. Rant aside. I guess I'll contribute to the village's prosperity. With that decision, I made my way towards the academy. The amount of times I had ever gone to that place could be counted on one hand, and those were all times that I had met up with Itachi. However, located within the academy was a place called the Mission Assignment Desk. During the war, and because I was Anbu, my missions had been given to me directly from Danzo and or the Hokage. They were mostly dangerous missions that required me to work with a large team of other Anbu in order to accomplish or assassination missions against high-priority enemy targets. As a result of this, I had never gone to the mission assignment desk where regular shinobi went to receive their missions. Now, though, since I wasn't a part of Root, though I still had to take 75% of the missions Danzo gave me, I had to go to the mission assignment desk to get missions and make some cash. And here I am. I thought as I looked at the academy in front of my view and walked into the building. Now then, if I remember correctly, I should be going this way. What was I thinking? I had a perfect memory, of course, I remembered correctly. With that little bit of narcissism out of the way, I walked down the halls of the building towards my destination, seeing children around the halls along the way. That would have been fine if that was all, but, whenever I walked down the hall, the students would give me a wide berth and open a path for me like the Red Sea. It didn't help that with my hearing, I could hear their muttering. That's him. The white demon of the leaf. Really? He doesn't look too tough to dash. SHH. Are you nuts? Remember what happened to Cho's group? W8, that was all him? He can't be much older than us. White Demon Sama. Over here. Please look my way. Does anyone even know his name? You get the general idea. I had to walk through this awkward and embarrassing scene. As for the reason why? Well, they were in front of me. A few meters in front of me was a group of 4 kids around my age who were huddled in a group. One of them peeked his head out at the sudden silence surrounding them and looked at me. His face paled. You guys. Huh? What is it, Adamu? One of the other kids said before he turned to look at me. His face turned pale as snow. Fuji. Shoki. Fuji was already frozen as he looked at me. Shoki stood up straight with his larger-than-normal 9-year-old frame and turned to the guy who had called his name. What is it? Dai pointed behind Cho, causing him to slowly turn his head towards me. He completely froze. DD-. Demon-sama. They chorused as they made way. Please shut up. I thought before walking past them and ignoring their antics. I could feel their fear elevate to intense levels and could smell the cold sweat dripping down their bodies, and I walked by them. Of course, I wanted nothing to do with them and simply continued on my way. I heard their sighs of relief as I made my way to my destination. I almost thought I was going to die. Me too. I don't feel safe here. Let's go the complete opposite direction of wherever he's going. Thank God they didn't make a scene. So annoying. I thought before walking ahead. Remember when I said I was going to think about coming here to socialize more? Yeah, that wasn't going to happen. What had I done to incur such infamy? Well, it was actually quite an interesting story. I had been waiting for Itachi at the entrance of the school one day since I hadn't had anything else to do at the time. After waiting for a while, I had thought that he was doing extra work like the good student he was. Come to find out that Itachi was being bullied, and because he didn't like fighting much, he wasn't hitting back as often. Under normal circumstances, I would have allowed Itachi to solve things on his own because I knew he could easily slaughter every kid in this academy with his eyes closed and a hand behind his back. Despite this, his mom was Makoto Uchiha, and I was in a rush to see her. As a result, I thoroughly crushed his would-be bullies and dragged him off to his home. Unfortunately, ever since then I had been met with this annoying scene every time I made my way across the school halls. It was very irritating. I broke myself out of my thoughts as I came across a room at the far end of the academy. I didn't have an appointment or anything, but I was more than sure that I would be pardoned if I just entered. They weren't doing anything in there anyway. I could sense their chakra. With that, I opened the door and entered the room. The mission assignment desk was located within a huge, wide-open space with 6 windows and high ceilings with 2 stick-like lights. The ceiling also had the kanji for the word shinobi printed on it. There was a long table where the Hokage and other ninjas sat and was where the missions were distributed. The talking between the shinobi, Hokage, and their advisors halted at my appearance before Danzo commented. "Yoro, I was not expecting to see you here." I looked between Danzo and the Hokage before bowing, sorry for my intrusion. I began, recently I've been quite lax and have been focusing on other aspects of my non-physical training, however. I stood up and glanced at them. I feel as if my skills will rust if not used consistently, and I've had plenty of time to rest myself. I was wondering if there was a mission available to me. There was a silence at that as the shinobi around the table looked to the Hokage, whose eyes were closed in thought. For a moment he stayed there in silence before opening his eyes. "Actually, there is something that I might have for you." I looked at him intently. "What would that be, Lord Hokage?" He looked down at his pile of mission documents and shuffled through them for a moment before seemingly finding the one he wanted. "Not too long ago, I sent Minato out on a mission to hold back Kumo's aggressive front. As you should know, their Jinchuriki is quite the problem and the 4th Raikage is a little impulsive." He then looked back up to me. "In any case, with Minato gone, I sent his students out on a simple reconnaissance mission, hopefully, to give them something to do and clear their mind." The Hokage outstretched his hand, the mission document still within it. I took a few steps forward and accepted the document. "Those two are to watch the border between Konoha and Kiri. I've been getting reports that the land of water has been moving suspiciously for a while." Hiruzen shook his head. "It seems like the lesson we taught them after the mission at the Tsuchigumo clan wasn't enough." "I see," I said before reading through the mission. I froze. An odd, indescribable foreboding feeling welled up within me. Hidden quest. Mission, save Rin. Reward, Rin lives, 50 stat points. Failure, Rin dies. Y/N. What? Yoru, is something the matter? the Hokage asked as he watched me. I looked at the screen that only I could see and mentally selected Y before focusing on the Hokage. Pardon my impudence, but is this mission really that safe? The Hokage looked at me seriously. Are you frightened? I shook my head, far from it, however. I looked down at this paper. I have an odd foreboding feeling. I don't know why that is. Of course, I do. It's from the pop-up telling me that Rin was going to die if I didn't save her. What exactly is going on? A shinobi must trust his instincts to keep themselves alive. Many have died because they ignored their better judgment. Danzo stated gravely. If you feel as if something is wrong, then I can send a few reinforcements. That won't be necessary. I stated as rolled up the mission statement. I feel like I'll be sufficient to handle whatever may come my way during this trip. Both Hiruzen and Danzo looked at each other before nodding. Very well, I'll trust your judgment. I bowed at them before quickly exiting the school. I body flickered towards the gate and handed the guards my mission statement before they signaled me ahead. With a nod of appreciation, I ran. My body rapidly carried me through the trees as I dashed towards my destination, yet my mind was preoccupied. What exactly could be going on with them? The Hokage wouldn't lie about this being a simple mission, therefore, a change must have occurred during the time after Kakashi and Rin left. But what? In any case, I thought as I hoped from tree to tree onwards towards my destination, I just have to make it there in time. Don't get me wrong, if Kakashi and Rin both died, I wouldn't necessarily feel anything. However, I would very much prefer that they don't die, especially if I could prevent it. I hoped they didn't die. I hopped off another tree before a drop of sweat fell down my forehead. Maybe I should have brought my teacher? She has a much longer detection range than I do, so she could find their chakra signatures much faster. I suppose I had been in a rush to save them and hadn't quite considered that. Was I perhaps worried? That couldn't be. I shook my head from those thoughts and decided that my speed wouldn't work out as it was. ID create, empty. With that, I dropped to the floor. There were a few reasons why shinobi didn't move at their very fastest when they were traveling to their destinations. For one, the enemy would be able to easily pick up their movements, and for another, jumping between trees at their fastest possible speed wasn't really the safest thing. Luckily in here, I didn't need to worry about that. With my body enhanced by chakra and my high HP, I wouldn't suffer too much damage from this. I blurred, my legs carrying my body at hypersonic speeds. Running this fast prevented me from effectively turning and changing direction, which was near impossible in a dense forest anyway. Good thing I never planned to do so. I bulldozed through the trees in my path with my hands up and traveled as fast as I could towards. The wind tried to claw at my skin while the trees crashed against me, however, with my durability, I was able to easily handle the strain of traveling this quickly. In a few minutes, I began to slow down before my feet ground to a halt. I looked behind me only to see that a large path of destruction had been created as a result of my traveling speeds. Good thing it was inside the ID. With that thought, ID escape. The mirrored dimension shattered, dumping me in an area within the border between fire country and water country. Now then, I thought as I looked around. Where could they be? The only information in the mission was that they were around the closest border between Kiri and Konoha. That just so happened to be around the peninsula that jutted out from the land of fire. I focused on my energy resonance but couldn't find their familiar chakra signatures. Then I'm going to need to cover more ground. With that, I created over 300 clones and had them spread out around the area. If anyone or more of them found Kakashi and Rin, then they would dispel and inform me of their whereabouts. I took a breath and sat down on the ground and wait. There was nothing much else I could do but lie and wait for my clones to communicate to me any new developments. Try not to die, you two, or dash. I snapped open my eyes. Shit. I quickly got up and activated my accelerated analysis. Shit. With an application of chakra, I enhanced my body's physical parameters. And ran. How the hell did they get themselves into that kind of situation? Weren't they supposed to be on a simple recon mission? I narrowed my eyes and ran as fast as my legs could carry me towards the area that one of my clones had found. My feet bounced off the trees, splintering them as I propelled myself forward as fast as I could. That looked like number 32 Anbu. I didn't care if they died, but if I could prevent it. As long as I can make it in time. The trees began to slowly disappear, so I dropped to the ground and ran as fast as I could towards the area. Going inside my ID would be ideal, however, if I suddenly appeared inside the enemy encirclement, it would be troublesome. Come on, almost there. Immediately after that thought went through my head, a pillar of water shot up to the sky from across the hill that was in my view. A drizzle of water fell down on me as a result of it, and at the same time, I could finally sense Kakashi and Rin's chakra signatures. I sharpened my gaze and moved faster just as many more pillars of water shot up from the sky. Almost there, wait. I mentally paused as my energy resonance picked up a bizarre chakra signature that was making its way in the same direction I was. It was bizarre in that there was a part of that chakra signature that was oddly familiar, however, that was overshadowed by another part of the same chakra signature that felt distinctly familiar. It was the same chakra signature that surrounded most of Konoha's trees. But those were formed from the first. While the chakra from them had mostly dissipated over the decades since their inception, I could still feel the residual chakra that they contained. How can someone have two completely different chakra signatures? What is with this situation? Who was that individual? Why were they headed in the same direction? Was it an ally or foe? I ignored all that as I approached closer and closer towards my goal, the light of the mid-afternoon sky peeking from between the gaps of the trees at the end of the forest. Almost there. And then I stopped. My eyes widened. The scene of Kakashi's lightning blade rammed through Rin's chest played out in front of me. That's not good. Rin fell to the ground while Kakashi tumbled to one knee. Damn! He took it out. One of the Kiri Anbu yelled. After all it cost us to obtain it. Another one replied. I looked at Kakashi and Rin's down forms before gritting my teeth. This isn't the time to sit around. However, before I could move, my body froze. Sadness. Despair. Betrayal. Those feelings were suddenly projected onto me with such intensity that my mind stopped. I felt a hot liquid run down my eyes before I touched my finger to my cheek. Tears. I looked around. Someone was in such despair that it was even affecting me as I picked it up with empathy. Before I could regain my senses, a wail of despondence reverberated throughout the battlefield. I whipped my head to the source only to realize that it had come from the individual with the bizarre chakra signature. Who is? Suddenly, another change occurred. My energy resonance picked up a mutation that was occurring with the chakras centered around Kakashi's left eye. The sudden change seemed to have drained him as he fell to the ground, no longer able to support himself. Who is that? Enemy reinforcements? Idiot. He came here all alone. The Kirinan talked among themselves at the emergence of the individual with the bizarre chakra, with the last guy throwing shuriken at the newcomer. Now's my chance. I dashed from my spot towards where Kakashi and Rin had felled, hoping to use the other individual as a distraction, however. There's another one. Damn it. Stop him. Don't let him get near her body. They quickly noticed me. They aren't Anbu for nothing. I thought, my eyes shifting through the battlefield before I caught notice of the bizarre chakra signature, only to notice that the individual was mowing down the surrounding Anbu, with branches piercing through his victims. Don't underestimate us. One of the enemy Anbu stated as he and another blocked my path. I tightly gripped a kunai in my hand before I hardened my gaze ahead. My eyes glowed as I activated deconstructive analysis. Move. In release, spiritual pressure. A formless wave of energy spread out from around me, freezing the two enemies in their tracks for a moment. A violently rotating blue sphere of chakra formed in the palm of my right hand before I drilled it through the chest of the closest enemy. The attack grinded through the skin, muscles, and bones before shredding the enemy's heart and bursting through his back. Die. The other enemy yelled as he moved to spear me with his sword. I quickly removed my hand from the corpse and simply turned my body towards him, allowing the sword to pierce through my chest before I grabbed onto his arm. I could sense his fear. I placed my free hand over his face. Why you damned mon dash? I didn't give him the luxury of finishing. Rasengan. His head violently exploded in a shower of blood and brain matter. I dropped to the ground and rapidly continued towards my destination until I finally reached them. You won't get away. I quickly looked above, only to see the forms of 5 Kiri Anbu above me. I quickly pulled the sword out of my chest and implanted an explosive seal on its handle with as much chakra as the weapon could take, and then I tossed it up. The shinobi above me had no way to dodge as the sword traveled up towards them and right as the handle of the weapon reached them. Explode! A devastating eruption of energy blasted the Kirinine out of the sky and sent shockwaves that reverberated throughout the forest, flattening some trees along the way. There was no more time to admire my work as a fraction of the enemy Anbu was quickly making its way towards me. Seeing this, I hurriedly placed my hands on both Kakashi and Rin and prepared to relocate. ID create. Ag. Branches suddenly sprouted up from the ground around me and skewered the numerous shinobi that had been surrounding me, stopping them dead in their tracks. Literally. Time seemed to slow as I turned my head towards the anomaly and saw him looking straight at me as well. Our gazes locked from across the battlefield for a brief moment. Empty. Reality was altered around me as the sounds of battle disappeared. The destruction caused by the fight still remained visible in this mirror dimension of mine, but there was no one here but me, Kakashi, and Rin. I first checked up on the girl, easily noting the hole in her chest and the fact that she wasn't breathing, she had no heart, and she was dead. However, I placed a hand on the hole in her chest. The only ones who die around me are those I want to. Mystical healing. I pumped all the chakra I had into reconstructing a heart where there was none. My energy was rapidly siphoned from the activity, but I made sure to focus and concentrate it directly towards her empty chest cavity. In a few moments, a brand new organ formed where there had previously been none. About 3.5 seconds has passed since she died. I thought before focusing some of the healing to her brain. I needed to stimulate her brain activity, or else even if I did manage to revive her, she would be a vegetable. With that, I looked at her brand new heart that wasn't beating. Let's fix that, shall we? I had focused the healing only to her brain and the production of her heart, but I had left the hole in her chest open for this specific reason. I reached my hand into her chest and gripped her heart before squeezing it multiple times. I just needed to jump-start it enough that it would pump on its own, and any extra damage I caused by doing this would be easily repaired by me later. What the? I paused and took my arm out of her chest as an orange cloak of chakra began to cover her body. I narrowed my eyes. I knew the feeling of this energy. I could feel it within Kushina whenever I got close to her. The hell happened during their mission? There was no time for me to dwell on that as the chakra cloak began to rapidly cover her body. I could tell that whatever bijou was inside of her had been improperly sealed and would escape if given time. This was done on purpose. I thought as I searched her body for the leak before finding the seal on her sternum. It was a two-pointed line seal, an incredibly weak seal to use for sealing powerful entities such as the bijou. However, she was in luck. Seals are one of my specialties. I thought as I lifted my sleeve and slightly curled my fingers before small balls of fire with the kanji of the elements floated above my fingertips. Earth, water, fire, wind, lightning. 5 elements seal. I jammed the seal onto her chest and immediately, the chakra dissipated. It was common knowledge that placing an odd-numbered seal on top of an even-numbered seal would cause an imbalance and block the seal. This will hold it for a little bit. If given time I could probably reconstruct a much more durable seal, however, I wanted to both get out of here and preferably have someone with more expertise on this subject look into it. With that, I fixed up her clothing before looking at her chest, noting that the bijou chakra had not only healed up the hole, but that there was a subtle rise and fall of her chest. Ping. Ping. Quest complete. Mission, save Rin. Reward, 50 stat points. I took a deep breath and sighed before looking over to the other individual who was in my care. Aside from some bruising on his frame and the dwindling chakra that I could sense from him, he seemed otherwise alright. I healed him up and fixed his scratches, however, the mutation of his left eye must have taken a large toll on him. I created a clone and had it hoist Kakashi while I held Rin in a bridal carry. After a quick nod to one another, we quickly ran back to the village. We hurried to head back home, taking a few minutes or so to reach the outskirts of Konoha. As soon as we stepped on familiar grounds, we exited the ID and approached the gates. The guards perked up at our approach and looked between us before stepping forward. Do you require assistance? I shook my head. They're just tired, however. I looked at him gravely. We have an S-ranked emergency. Their eyes widened. Open the gates. Hurry, hurry. Contact the elders. They yelled as they moved to action. I looked to them once more. Tell the Hokage to meet me at Bunker 3. They looked at each other before one of them nodded at me and vanished in a swirl of leaves. My clone and I then rapidly made our way to the hospital, the guards there quickly letting us through when they saw the forms over my shoulder. I had my clone check in Kakashi on the normal levels of the hospital while I went to its lower levels with Rin. A quick flare of my chakra granted me access to the bunker room within and I made my way to an empty room ahead. I opened the room with Rin still on my shoulders and gently placed her on the bed. I closed my eyes in concentration for a moment before creating a clone. It quickly left in search of either Minato and/or Kushina. They were better at this stuff than I was and would be able to give much better help to Rin. I leaned on the bed in exhaustion and ran my fingers through my hair. How could a simply recon mission get so complicated? Yoru, gamer. How did a simple recon mission turn into this? The Hokage stated with a sigh as he stood around the bed Rin was resting on. Yoru. Danzo began as he looked at me with his one lone eye. What happened? I want to know the sequence of events that led to this. I looked around me to see the faces of Danzo, the Hokage, both the advisors Koharu and Hamura, Minato, and finally Kushina. The later two's faces laced with severity as they looked at Rin, more specifically, her seal. I began. I ran towards the mission area as quickly as I could in order to rendezvous with both Kakashi and Rin during their mission. However, I could immediately find them, so I spread out my clones to search for their chakra signature. I turned my gaze back towards Rin. One of my clones found them surrounded my Anbu, so I made my way over, but by the time I arrived, I found Rin impaled by Kakashi's lightning blade. Their expressions changed, however. Hiruzen raised a hand and asked seriously, "There's more to this, isn't there?" I nodded my head. You already know of my ability to detect emotions on a near-infectious level. I could tell that Rin had decided to let herself get impaled and that it had not been Kakashi's objective. The expressions of everyone around relaxed ever so slightly. Damn Kirigakure. Hamura stated as he looked on the bed, they implanted one of our own with a tailed beast and tried to destroy our village with it? His face curled in displeasure. How did you escape from there alive? Koharu asked me seriously. Are you telling me you were able to fight of a platoon of 32 Anbu level shinobi, safely secure your comrades, and escape? I shook my head. Unfortunately, I'm not that skilled yet. That was partially true. I could have killed them all, but I might not have been able to keep Rin and Kakashi safe at the same time. Admittedly, I could have just entered my ID, appeared next to Kakashi and Rin, and taken them back inside my ID. However, my emotions had been clouded by that other individual to the point where I hadn't made the best decision. Then? She asked with a raised brow. I turned towards the Hokage with a heavy gaze. Lord Hokage, do you know if the first Hokage had any illegitimate offspring? That threw them for a loop. The third quirked a brow at the question before shaking his head. The first was a genuine individual and was a simple and honest man. I highly doubt that he would do something of the sort. Why do you ask? I looked down and thought, while I had been making my way towards Kakashi and Rin, I had felt a bizarre chakra signature that felt very similar to the forests surrounding Konoha. That's... Koharu began. Hashirama frowned. That can't be after all those forests were created by the first Hokage. Danzo finished as he gazed at me. Do you think you could be mistaken? I shook my head. If it had only been his chakra that had been similar, I could have possibly dismissed him as some sort of close relative, however. My eyes narrowed slightly. He no doubt used would release to slaughter the Kirigakure Anbu. There was pin-drop silence at that statement. Danzo's eye sharpened. The Hokage frowned. Hashirama and Koharu looked shocked. Both Minato and Kushina were working on Rin, but I could feel their surprise. The Hokage sighed with clear exhaustion. An S-ranked emergency indeed. How could this happen? Koharu asked. Was the first really promiscuous? Maybe we misjudged him. Hashirama began. He always acted like such an honest fool too. Don't jump to conclusions. Danzo stated. I nodded. I can think of only 3 reasons for what I experienced. I began, collecting everyone's attention towards me. The first is that the Hokage was loose and fired his cannon everywhere he Yoru. Kushina stated as she looked at me seriously. Everyone seemed to share her sentiment. I shrugged. The other case is that someone somehow made a clone of the first Hokage. Everyone's expression turned even more serious. Though I have my doubts about that, it is not an impossibility. Because that amount of despair could only have come from someone close. Fun fact, in the case of a national emergency, Konoha kept the DNA of its most powerful shinobi for the use of the impure world reincarnation. The only reason I even knew that was because I had been asked for my genetic information before for that very fact. The Hokage sighed. He seemed to be doing that more often, and looked at me. And your third conjecture? I thought back to the conversation I had earlier with Orochimaru. The only other possibility I can think of is that someone was spliced with the first Hokage's DNA and obtained his wood release. Konoha had tried multiple times in the past to recreate the first Hokage's wood release within their village. Of course, every single experiment met with failure, and I was unaware of any that had somehow survived. The first Hokage's genes were just too dominating and were like a parasite to individuals whose bodies weren't compatible enough. Of course, if any individuals had secretly survived Hashirama's cells, it would make sense that I wouldn't know. The Hokage looked up to the ceiling before shaking his head. Whatever had been said here today will remain an S-ranked secret. Any mention of Rin's condition to anyone will be met with my swift and violent anger. Is that clear? No one objected. Good. The Hokage said with a nod before looking at Minato and Kushina. How is she doing? She's holding through. Minato stated as he looked at the seal. However, while this seal was definitely a botched job, it was also pre-programmed to release under certain conditions. The effects could have been disastrous. Kushina stated as she gazed at Rin's sternum seriously. We've managed to stabilize the seal so that it will actually function as such. However, we're still working on implanting a different seal in place of this shoddy job. What tailed beast is within her? Danzo asked. 3. Was Minato's reply. The Hokage somehow seemed even more exhausted. This situation is much too complex. I internally agreed. The first has given out the bijou as a sign of peace. Why he did that still eluded me. Who would give out weapons of mass destruction as a sign of peace? Now, however, Konoha was in possession of Kirigakure's bijou. Who knew what kind of precedent this would set in the kinds of the other villages? Humph, this is none other than the fault of their own arrogance. Hashirama sneered. They were the ones who willingly gave our shinobi a tailed beast. We did not steal it from them and they cannot claim as such. However, you know that's not how the other villages will see this. Koharu replied. They'll see it as Konoha trying to hoard more power in order to reign supreme. This won't sit well with them regardless of the underlying cause. Hashirama frowned but nodded in agreement. Lord Hokage. Minato began, I suggest that you send word to the other Kage before Kirigakure has a chance to spread the word. On one end, if Kiri sends out word first, it will seem exactly as Elder Koharu stated and the rest of the world will view us as power-hungry. However, if we let everyone know the situation from our mouth first, while they will still be on edge, they will be much less likely to take action as Kirigakure won't get the chance to twist the narrative. What will you do? Danzo asked the Hokage. Hiruzen closed his eyes for a moment before nodding. That is most likely the best course of action to prevent any more friction between the hidden villages. It would look even worse if the world thinks that Konoha is beginning to gather power just after signing a ceasefire with IWA. That is sound. Hashirama stated. Koharu nodded, agreed. The Hokage slightly inclined his head before looking at Rin. As for her, we'll be able to finish in a couple of hours. Kushina stated as she looked at Minato, who nodded in return. Very well. Hiruzen said. I've requested a Yamanaka to come in and observe her mental state to make sure nothing was done to her mind and that she is in a sound state of being. I'll leave the rest to you. Saying that he turned and walked out of the room. Hashirama and Koharu nodded and followed. Danzo looked at me. Your involvement always seems to make situations more intriguing. With that statement, he too left the room. As the door closed behind him, my body was suddenly dragged into a soft embrace. I blinked. What is this for? You saved her. Kushina began as she hugged me tighter. Thank you. There's no need to thank me. I would have dash. Hush you. She said with a smile before eventually letting me go. I then felt a pat on my head and turned to see Minato smiling at me. Thank you, Yoru. He rubbed my hair for a moment before looking back at Rin. She and Kakashi have already lost a Bito and so far, my team has been incomplete. You protected them when I couldn't and for that I am grateful. I accepted his thanks. However, Minato stated as he glanced at Rin, I don't understand why she jumped in front of Kakashi's Chidori. Doing that to him after already losing a Bito would almost certainly cause him to mentally collapse. That's true. Kushina began as she continued to work on Rin's seal. She wouldn't have done such a thing unless there was no other way. Well, in a normal situation, how could the enemy village figure that Rin would willingly walk into her own home with a ticking time bomb? I asked. The paused for a moment before Minato asked, You're saying that they somehow controlled her? Or at the very least stopped her from killing herself? I nodded. That's the only thing that comes to mind. Rin's been through a lot, but I believe it would be odd for her to have her best friend kill her and mentally scar him for the rest of his life. But how? Kushina asked. I could only imagine that they either placed a mental block on her or placed another seal on her of some sort. I suppose the first one could be true since we found no evidence of the second. We'll find out soon. Minato stated. Time passed as Minato and Kushina worked on the seal before about an hour or so went by. I perked up and looked to the door before saying, "Come in." The person paused before opening the door and entering the room. I blinked in recognition. "Wolf?" The blonde woman tilted her head at the sound of my voice before smirking, "Please, it's Casamona when I'm not on the field." She then turned towards Minato and Kushina before bowing. "I apologize for the interruption, but I was called here to do a mental scan of a patient." "Please, come over," Kushina stated as she moved her body a little to allow Casamona through. "Thank you," she said as she moved to the bed before gently placing her hands on the sides of Rin's temples and closed guards her eyes. A little time passed before Casamona's eyelids trembled and opened. "Well," Minato asked, "did you find anything?" "Yeah. She's messed up in the head." "Huh?" Kushina asked as she narrowed her eyes. "Explain." Casamona looked down at the girl and continued, "Her emotions are a jumbled mess inside her head with her memories flashing by every second. Her consciousness seems to be in some sort of web of sorrow and resignation and is having trouble resurfacing." "What do you dash?" "This girl is in a coma induced by her unstable emotional state," Casamona stated as she stood up. "The most I could do was create a path for her. But she's going to have to be the one to walk through it. I'm not keen on forcing her consciousness directly." "What about any foreign mental blocks?" Minato asked, "Did you find any?" Casamona shook her head, "None whatsoever. Every mental block I found was self-induced." There was silence at that, after which Casamona stood up and dusted herself off. "Well, if that is all, I'll have to go write a report now." "Thank you," Kushina stated. The blonde woman looked at her. "I'm merely doing my duty." With that, she looked towards me. "I'll see you around Yoru." However, my eyes stared intently at her, more specifically her stomach. "Is something the matter?" she asked with a tilt of her head. I looked her in the eyes. "Can I touch your belly?" Kushina raised a brow. Casamona blinked. "I suppose so." I touched her stomach and focused as intently as possible within before I removed it. "As I thought." "What exactly?" The Yamanaka blinked. I pointed at her stomach. "You're pregnant." "Congrats." She froze. Kushina's expression was that of surprise before she grinned. "Congratulations." Minato looked over and chimed in, "You should strap your lover in place and make sure he doesn't escape his parental duties." Kushina looked at him oddly. "That's rich coming from you." "Oi." "That was years ago, I didn't know how to manage being a dad at the time." Excuses." I looked to Casamona, who was still frozen in place, and stated, "Look at the bright side, you won't have to go on missions for months. Look what happened to me when I went on one after that long." Her body trembled. "I'm going to neuter him." I blinked. "Oh, poor shark." Without saying another word, Casamona left the room. I turned back towards Minato and Kushina, noting that they were still having their little squabble before I turned to Rin. Information about this world was filled with plenty of blank spots to me, but I felt that I'd changed something by saving her life. Hopefully. I squinted my eyes. It's for the better. Chapter 19. Hiruzen's POV. I'm so tired of this shit, I thought with a sigh as I signed another piece of paper. After having worked tirelessly for 3 days straight in my office, I now only had a few more documents to sign. Maybe paperwork is the enemy's tactic to tire me to death? I mused. It would honestly be one of the better attempts. With that, I stamped and signed another piece of paper before I stopped and rubbed my aching shoulders with a grimace. It didn't help that the situation with the three-tailed bijou a few months back had made my life much more miserable. As expected, the other nations weren't too keen on Konoha having both the strongest bijou and an additional one. IWA was getting more nervous, especially since they had lost one of their Jinchuriki and hadn't found a trace of the Four Tails ever since. Kumo was more aggressive than ever, had been trying more reverently to push against our borders. Sand was on edge, but reassured by our allowance, however slight that reassurance may be. Needless to say, Kirigakure was quite livid at their loss, but they had willingly implanted their bijou into an enemy shinobi. We had no say in their actions, and so the consequences of that idiotic decision were theirs to bear. Good thing I won't have to bother with this much longer. The aftershock of the war had been substantial, as evident by the ever-increasing piles of paper on my desk. My decision to preemptively strike a truce between us and IWA had been met by disapproval by Danzo and some of the other Jonin commanders who had wanted redress for their comrades who had died in the war. What mitigated this tension, however, was the fact that our potential casualties had reduced by thousands courtesy of mystical healing. Well, that was what Yoru called it anyway. Seeing their comrades and family members healed of injuries that normally would have been permanently debilitating had quelled their hearts enough that they had reluctantly agreed to my decision to end the squabble between us and IWA. However, even though their wrath had been somewhat mitigated, I had already decided to step down from my position. After a meeting with the Fire Daimyo and his council along with my advisors and Danzo, I had managed to convince them to accept the candidate I had chosen to replace me as Hokage. And, done. I leaned back with a relieved sigh as the final paper was stamped and signed. I soon straightened back up and called in my secretary before having her sort and send the documents to their respective areas. I finished in time too, I thought while looking outside. I had a scheduled meeting, so after everything was said and done, I left my office. The Hokage residence was a large mansion occupied by the Hokage during their tenure and was located close to both the Academy and Hokage Rock. One of its purposes was to allow the Hokage to live on neutral ground as a gesture for them to not act on behalf of any clan or family, but to act on behalf of the village. I also used that area as a meeting point for individuals who wanted to converse with me. As Hokage, it was important that I listen to the voices of the common folk and shinobi alike. For now, however, I had already scheduled a meeting with someone important and didn't want to be late. Based on his moniker, I knew he wouldn't be either. It took me no time to arrive at the guest reception area of the Hokage residence. I made my way to the front and center stage of the room before I sat down on the pillow in a seiza, closed my eyes, and waited. I was accompanied with nothing but silence for a while, before a presence entered the room. Lord Hokage, a voice said. I opened my eyes to see Minato taking a knee on the ground in front of me, his head slightly lowered. Please, lift your head, I began. Someone with your accomplishments in the field need not lower themselves so easily. Minato raised his head before slightly shaking it. I've only ever done what was required of me to do for the village and its people. Anything that has come of that is merely extraneous. I couldn't help but smile a little at that before I schooled my features. I believe that you will carry on the will of fire, so I want to entrust you with the future of the Hidden Leaf and the shinobi world. Here I paused and observed his serious countenance for a moment before I concluded with my gaze sharpened. You will accept, won't you? His eyes locked with mine. There was no hesitation in his words as he replied, I shall do my best to deserve your trust, Lord Third. I smiled before releasing a light sigh. I wish this could have been done under better circumstances. What lies ahead will not all be peaceful. I'm prepared for it, was his immediate reply. I smiled. I know you will make me proud. Yoru, gamer. Yoru's POV. The restriction seal was spread throughout my body, creating an intricate intersecting line of script that glowed a dull blue hue. I slowly clenched my hand into a fist, feeling a bit of resistance from every inch of movement, before I nodded to myself. Let's begin. ID create, werewolf. A bubble of reality spread out with me as the epicenter and encompassed my view. The environmental theme was altered as the bright afternoon sky transformed into a gloomy midnight firmament and the shining sun turned into a glittering moon. I raised my head and pulled out a kunai from my inventory before I looked around me. I paused as the leaves rustled behind me before I immediately jumped to the side as a blur rushed by. It was a bipedal canine creature with sharp elongated fangs, red eyes, pointed ears, and furry skin. All the things you'd expect of a werewolf. Werewolf LVL 85. HP 150,000. STA 100,000. STR 1,500. VIT 1,500. X 1,000. INT 1,000. WIS 1,000. NG 1,000. EXP gain 500. With a growl, the furry beast went on all fours before securing its hind legs and thrusting off the ground. The force of its acceleration crumbled the ground beneath it as it flew towards me at immense speeds. My eyes glowed before I leaned back, placed my palms flat on the ground, and used it as a springboard to catapult my legs forward, catching the beast as soon as it was above me. I felt its bones crack and flesh mold to my foot as I attacked its weak point, causing it to rocket towards the sky. I flipped myself up and immediately ran lightning through my kunai before throwing it up, its speed easily piercing through both the sound barrier and the wolf's skin. It howled in agony, which I ignored as I twirled the string I had attached to the kunai around my arm. With a pull, the wolf came flying down at hypersonic speeds before it impacted the ground with a resounding crash. The shockwave of the impact leveled the trees around me and spread out towards the distance before only silence reigned. With a wave of my hand, I cleared the dust and walked towards my downed opponent who was whining pitifully. So, with a raised leg, I channeled a large amount of fire nature chakra through it before I stomped down. You have earned 500 EXP. The monster crumbled to dust and disappeared, only leaving behind the kunai which I had lodged within it. I picked it up and twirled it before turning around. Ambushing me isn't gonna work, you know? I can sense you from over 5 kilometers away. While I was pretty sure they couldn't understand my words, they still came out of hiding, causing me to turn towards them. There in front of me were 5 werewolves, each with their fangs exposed with saliva dripping down their maw. With a roar, they all charged towards me, to which I remained calm and took a breath. I sharpened my gaze and tapped my foot on the ground, running chakra through it and causing spiked pillars of earth to erupt from below. The beasts bobbed and weaved through my attack as they traveled on all fours before they came only a few meters away. I tapped my foot once more, causing a wall of earth to erupt right in front of me before I leaped up high. In but a moment, the werewolves crashed through the wall and skidded to a stop before turning their heads every which way for my trail. I could see them sniff the air before they stopped and looked above. Unfortunately, they were a little late. With 5 shuriken in hand, I spun and tossed them at the werewolves, skewering all 5 through the neck and implanting the shuriken through the ground. They writhed and clawed at their necks, however, I wrapped the wire I had attached to the shuriken around my wrists. With little exertion, I pulled, the resulting motion lifting causing me to travel faster towards the ground. My landing caused the ground to fracture around me before I grabbed onto the string with both hands and spun. The 5 wolves wailed as I made them crash through the surrounding trees. As I spun, I ran a powerful current through the wire which electrocuted the wolves, after which I tossed them up into the air. Their angles and directions of impact were calculated by me, and with my deconstructive analysis still active, I knew their weak points. With that in mind, I created 5 spikes of earth which protruded from the ground directly in the locations that wolves would fall to. With their durability, the earth spikes would more than likely crumble, so I reinforced them with my chakra and waited. It didn't take long for gravity to fully take hold of the 5 wolves as they fell down from above and skewered themselves on the spiked earth. I took a step back as I looked at them before I gathered a ball of plasma between my hands. Storm style, laser circus. 5 laser beams extended from the ball of energy between my palms and pierced the struggling wolves through the head, killing them. You have earned 500 EXP. 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 As the wolves turned to dust, I returned the soil to its original state and moved to collect my shuriken, before I paused and sighed. They don't learn, I suppose I shouldn't expect any better from them. With that, I immediately ducked as a form flew past me from above. Before it escaped my reach, I grabbed its ankle and slammed it against another form that had tried to sneak attack me from behind. The two werewolves flew through numerous trees and pulled up a cloud of dust in their wake, but it wasn't over yet. Another two energy signatures tried a pincer attack as they approached from my left and right, so right before they were about to touch me, I jumped up. Their momentum and close proximity prevented them from changing course and caused them to crash into each other. With them disoriented, I landed on their heads before I brought my feet together, causing their heads to slam together once more. I jumped, weaved a string-attached shuriken around both their necks and wrapped said string around my arms before I landed to the ground. My arms layered across each other, I ran lightning through the wires and made a scissoring motion. The added current sharpened the wires enough that they slowly seared through the necks of both wolves, causing them to howl in agony. Before they stopped. Their heads rolled to the ground, yet their bodies were still moving, so with a deep breath, I generated a ball of fire and packed a dense amount of chakra into it. Fire style, majestic destroyer flame. A torrent of orange fire spewed out of my hand and engulfed both the wolves. The intensity of the flames increased as the flames began to turn blue from the amount of energy I was adding to the attack. And then they turned pure white. The heat from the attack distorted the air and melted the earth as I incinerated the wolves. Afterwards, I slowly decreased the energy output of the fire beam until it stopped. I lowered my hand, gazing at the aftermath of my assault. The wolves had been carbonized from the blaze, the eruption creating a blast line that seemed to distance over a kilometer. The surrounding trees caught on fire, which spread through the forest, causing the sky to glow orange. What I had come to figure out was that hand seals not only helped the user mold their chakra into their preferred shape, but it also allowed them to modulate how much energy they were putting into their technique. Someone like me who required no hand seals could pack as much chakra as they wanted into any energy-based technique. However, if I took it too far and used up too much energy, I could suffer from chakra exhaustion or worse. Since I had such a large pool of chakra and since I didn't need to use hand seals, I didn't limit myself too much, and the damage from my chakra-based attacks were all based upon how much energy I used for them. Of course, there were some exceptions like the Rasengan, which amplified a small amount of energy in a unique way that caused more damage than if I had used that much chakra in a normal attack. I stopped my muse in favor of jumping just as the two wolves that I had thrown earlier appeared. I backflipped over them and landed softly on my feet before I pulled out a kunai. They growled angrily at me and moved to rush at me once more, however, I was faster. I ran wind and fire attributed chakra through the blade before horizontally slashing my arm. The amplified fire attack was honed and traveled to the wolves, who were unable to retreat in time before they were engulfed. The trees behind them were sliced in half and incinerated from the attack, while the monsters themselves fared no better. Their bodies were split in two from the waist, with the wounds instantly cauterized from the heat. It all didn't matter, however, as they soon decomposed into particles like all over defeated monsters. You have earned 500 EXP. 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 With that, I took a breath and waited silently. With 10 down, the pack leader should arrive. A resounding howl echoed throughout the forest. And she's here. It appeared outside my detection range before I could finally sense it 5 kilometers away. It bulldozed through the trees as it traveled towards me, and within a matter of seconds, it came into view. Werewolf, pack leader, LVL 125. HP, 250,000. STA, 200,000. STR, 2,500. VIT, 2,500. Dex, 2,000. Int, 1,500. WIS, 1,500. NG, 2,000. EXP gain, 15,000. It was twice as large as the other werewolves and had silver, instead of brown, fur which glistened in the moonlit sky. It growled at me in anger, yet it circled me cautiously on all fours. I suppose this one is smarter, for a dog. I thought as I watched it with a close eye. Stats weren't singular and usually had multiple meanings depending on the individual. For example, someone could have high INT denoting their overall knowledge of a particular subject or denoting their street smarts. Different kinds of intelligence which would result in different kinds of results for two different people. Another would be STR, as for the most part, an individual would need to work out each muscle group in order to make all parts strong. Their STR stat could refer to their leg strength or their arm strength. Additionally, there was also a difference between lifting strength and striking power. All this, however, meant nothing to me. When my INT increased, all aspects of my intelligence increased proportionally. When my SCR increased, all my muscles proportionally increased in strength along with my lifting and striking strength. The same was true for my other stats if it was applicable, like DEX, increasing both my movement and reaction speeds. That was one of the benefits of my gamer ability. Why did this matter? Because even if this wolf had 1000 INT, it did not mean for a moment that it was more knowledgeable than me. The wolf growled once more before suddenly zooming towards me in a blur of motion. I crossed my arms protectively before I was swatted away through the trees. Though it might be a little quicker in terms of its reactions. I thought before I skidded to a stop and removed my restrictions. Unfortunately, it didn't help much as the wolf was already upon me with its paw raised high. With its speed greater than mine, I was unable to dodge in time as I was batted into the air for some distance. I crashed through multiple trees as my back slid across the ground to a stop. I uncrossed my arms and slowly stood up before dusting myself off. The pack leader stood in front of me with fury evident in its eyes while I looked on at it in boredom. Of course, its attacks had stung, however, my regeneration rate was immense. Seemingly angry at my dismissal of it, it charged at me once more. However, I was now much better prepared. Accelerated analysis allowed me to analyze its movements much more rapidly, while deconstructive analysis provided me with its weak points. With that, I crouched right below the claw that had been aimed at my head, dodging it by a hair. The wolf now left open, I saw and exploited the glowing red dot on the side of its ribcage. I rotated my waist as I extended my fist, crashing it into the tender side of its ribs. My fist sunk deep into the beast's flesh as it crushed its ribs, causing it to howl in agony. I wasn't done as I jabbed 2 fingers into a glowing red spot located on its arm, disabling it. A kick to a weak point on its leg caused it to drop to a knee, while a knee to its sternum caused it to heave. I looked down on it before placing an open palm to its face and charging up a ball of lightning. Before I was smacked in the head and sent through multiple trees. My body skidded and bounced across the ground before sliding to a stop. Dust picked up behind me. That bitch. I thought as I messaged my jaw, which was fine in less than a second anyway, and stood up. The thing had attacked me with its tail the moment I had raised my hand. Even with one leg, it came upon me rather quickly with a snarl on its face, intent on gnawing my bones. I simply raised my index finger to the sky in response, a pillar of earth impacting the wolf from beneath in response. It howled to the moon as it was sent through the air, after which I positioned myself right below it. My palm pointed up towards it. I charged a ball of electricity before I released a beam towards the sky towards the wolf. Gravity assisted it in its descent as it fell while still within my blast before I stopped and stepped back. With a little concentration, I caused a pillar of earth to protrude from the ground right below the wolf before it impacted the column with its gut. It groaned and fell off the column unmoving, so I walked towards it and placed a hand on its chest. I could sense its despair as its instincts no doubt learned it of its imminent demise. Too bad, there was nothing it could do. I formed a Rasengan within its chest, blending its insides into mulch and causing blood spray out of its orifices. Its chest spiraled and burst as it spasmed and died. You have earned 15,000 EXP. With that done, the wolf disintegrated, leaving behind a few fangs and... Oh! I thought as something glittering caught my attention. I went forward and picked it up before raising it to the moonlight. Minor beast essence, werewolf. The crystallized form of the energy contained within the werewolf. Absorbing its energy allows you to gain a portion of its stats. Gain 1% of the werewolf's STR and VIT. I raised a brow at that. I didn't think I would see one of these ever again. Well, it wasn't quite the same, but years back I had absorbed a chakra beast core which shared many similarities with this one. There were, of course, many differences. For example, this one didn't specifically say chakra beast and there was no elemental affinity attached to the beast essence. Still though, I thought as I tossed it up and down a few times before sending it to my inventory. I someone in mind to give this to, so I wouldn't use it right away. The rest of the stuff was decently valuable since the fangs and claws of chakra beasts were quite useful and durable. Though this wasn't a chakra beast per se, it might as well be one. With that, I picked up the rest of the loot and waited for a while before I sighed. I guess I'm done for the day. So, I thought to myself. ID escape. The sky cracked and shattered, the sun replacing the moon and the bright blue sky replacing the dark nighttime sky. It was unfortunate that with all the missions I had had to take, there had been very few opportunities for me to spend my time grinding dungeons. While it wouldn't drastically increase my stats, it would increase my levels. With that, I looked down to my torn-up clothes and simply willed them away. Seriously, why would I bother to change clothes if I could just use the henge to create some? True, experts would be able to see through discrepancies in your transformation, however, mine came with physical changes as well. Besides, while high-level shinobi could see through the disguise, they couldn't see through them, unless they had special eyes, so I was fine regardless. With that, I created a ball of water and drenched myself with it before heating my body to dry off. Afterward, I created some clothes on myself and touched them, noting how they felt like actual fabric. With that, I decided to pay my adorable sister a visit, so I traveled to Kushina and Minato's household before placing my palm on the side of the door. With a flare of my chakra, I obtained access to their living area as the door opened. I walked through it, sensing Kushina and Mito's chakra as I entered. The delightful sounds of humming made their way to my ears as I approached the kitchen, eventually realizing that they were coming from the woman within. Kushina paused her cooking and turned around with a radiant smile on her face. Yoru! What brings you here at this time? The woman wore a single long ponytail with bangs framing the side of her face. In addition to that, she wore an apron that went down to her knees, a yellow shirt, jeans rolled up to her ankles and a pair of fuzzy pink slippers. Minato is a lucky dude. Speaking of, I'm just here to play around for a little bit since I don't have much to do, though I'm curious where Minato is. Kushina turned back around and continued focusing on her cooking before she replied. He was suddenly called on by the Hokage for a private meeting not too long ago. She snickered. I bet he did something dumb to get himself into trouble. However, something in my brain stirred at that news, but I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Doesn't really affect me though. So I shrugged. Let's hope he dash. Big brother. A voice suddenly yelled from above before a form fell upon my back, its arms wrapped around my neck. I paused and supported her before I smirked. Mito, how's it going? She smiled playfully, I'm good. Mito Uzumaki Namikazes. Kushina said, turned around, arms crossed, ladle in hand while tapping her right foot. What have I told you about Tree walking inside the house? The girl shrank behind me before sticking out her tongue. A tick mark appeared in Kushina's forehead as her hair threatened to move about wildly. Why you little? The girl on my back giggled in response, however, I really didn't want Kushina to explode, so I turned around to my side. Come on, apologize to your mother. Mito put on a sour face as she stared at her mother's angry visage before she relented. Sorry, mommy. The woman in question softened her expression and twitched a smile. You seem to listen to Yoro much more than you do me. The girl simply tightened her hands around my neck and giggled. Kushina rolled her eyes and shooed us away. Whatever, go play or something. That said, she turned back and continued to focus on her cooking before she added, I'm making something right now so you can stay for lunch if you want. I nodded as I made my way to the living room area that was across the kitchen. I might take you up on that. I took Mito off my back and placed her down on the chair, ignoring her expression of protest as I stared her in the eye. So, you've started training. Her expression brightened as she nodded. I'm going to be a strong shinobi, just like you. I tilted my head. You know, your parents are quite strong as well. Quite a bit stronger than I am, to be honest. But you're cooler. I heard that. Kushina yelled from the kitchen. I couldn't help but chuckle a little. I took one more look at Mito before my brows scrunched in thought. I was thankful that she hadn't been born before the war, or she would have been forced to join the academy at an early age. Now though, the war was more or less over and so there was not as much a need to send out children as young as her out to the field. That being said, every shinobi started out as a child soldier and she no doubt would want to pursue this life. Still though, I thought as I gazed at her, I don't want her to get hurt. Even if children Mito's age were no longer participating in missions and the like, Minato and Kushina had started to begin training their daughter so that she would have a solid foundation for the future. True to her heritage, the girl had some natural skill and already had low Jonin level reserves despite her age. However, it's not enough. She could still get hurt if she ever went out on the field, but I wouldn't be there to help her. Yoru, what's wrong? The girl asked as she stared up at me with her big blue eyes. I ran my hands through her hair. Nothing much. Just thinking about some things. She closed her eyes under my touch before I singled out a strand of her hair and yanked it off. Ow! She yelled as she grabbed her head before staring at me with a dirty look. That was mean. I smiled and saved the strand of hair in my inventory before running my hands through her hair once more. A shinobi should always be on alert against her enemies. But you're not my enemy, she said before hugging me. You're my big bro. Bro. My body froze up. Too cute. Ah, Yoru. Mito said in remembrance as she separated herself from me and laid her palms in front of me. Look what I can do. I blinked and focused before my eyes widened in slight surprise as Mito released a chakra chain from her hands. That's... He smiled pridefully. Hee, Mommy said that it was a special technique of our clan. So? What do you think? I'm amazing, right? She puffed her chest as if waiting for a compliment. You are pretty amazing, I said while looking at the long floating chains of dense chakra and held it. I immediately felt the effects as my chakra felt restrained. I tilted my head and focused my attention on the structure and composition of the chains and couldn't help but notice how it was different from Kushina's. For one thing, instead of glowing in a dull yellow hue, it was dark green. Furthermore, with my familiarity with natural energy, I could sense it in all around us and found that Mito's chains seemed to absorb the exogenous energies in the atmosphere. Kushina snorted, why don't you tell Yoro the circumstances in which you activated your bloodline? She stated with a look. Mito's face turned bright red as she hung her head down. I raised a brow. Do I want to know? Kushina began as she tightened her gaze and clenched her fists, veins popping on her forehead. She has guts, I'll give her that. She dared to steal my secret stash of cup ramen that I'd kept in a place too high to reach. I tilted my head, so she manifested the chains to reach the ramen. I admit that was definitely an unorthodox awakening scenario. If only that was what happened. Kushina trailed off as she trembled. Mito looked away from her mother and whistled suspiciously. Imagine my surprise when I caught her using tree walking to reach my secret stash and steal my ramen. And instead of immediately begging for forgiveness like a good girl, she had the audacity to wrap me up in her chakra chains and trap me while she ate my ramen. It was at this point that Kushina's chest heaved up and down in anger as she tightly gripped her ladle. "You had a pan in your hands!" Mito screamed. "You can't convince me that you were going to use it to cook. So, you decided to trap your own mother in chains and eat her ramen? It was better than getting smashed in the head with a pan. You deserve a good head bashing, you disrespectful young lady. You should never take a woman's ramen. Maybe if you shared, I wouldn't have to steal your stupid ramen. Don't you dare insult my ramen." I stared at the mother-daughter duo with a dead look and questioned all the life decisions I had made up to this point. Where did I go wrong? As I was lost in thoughts and as they continued this back-and-forth argument, I suddenly snapped my head up as a large chakra signature entered the home, Mito mirroring my action as she stood up. "Daddy!" She yelled as she jumped off me and ran for the door even though the individual had not yet been in view. I raised a brow. "Well, that's interesting." The sound of Mito's giggling became louder as Minato approached the interface between the kitchen and dining room, Mito on his shoulders. Kushina huffed at Mito before turning to Minato with a smug look on her face. She slid next to him and playfully elbowed his ribs. "So? What did he say?" She then leaned against him nonchalantly. "Honestly, what did you do wrong this time? I wonder how hard the Hokage grilled you." She finished while giggling. Minato raised a brow. "Well." He paused as if trying to find a proper way to explain his predicament. "He made me the next Hokage." Kushina sighed. "Honestly, Minato, how did you screw up so?" She trailed off, eyes widening as she finally comprehended what her husband had told her before she turned towards him. "Wait, you." Minato gave her his usual charming smile and nodded. "I'm going to be named the fourth Hokage of the Hidden Leaf." My eyes widened. Kushina paused as her cheeks grew rosy before she threw herself against Minato. "Congratulations, you know." As she rubbed herself against him, Minato struggled to balance himself. "Oi, oi." It also didn't help that Mito was joyfully hanging onto his hair as well. "Yay! Daddy's going to be the Hokage." After a moment, Kushina stopped and took a step back before recomposing herself with a cough. She then looked at Minato seriously before starting. "Thank you so much for all your hard work." Minato straightened himself before replying. "Thank you." With that, Kushina smiled and hugged Minato once more, creating a picture-perfect family moment with Kushina and Minato embracing while Mito hung onto her father's hair. So, this is when he is passed on the mantle. I thought to myself. I had known it would happen at some point during or after the Third Great Shinobi War, but I had had no idea when specifically. Looking at the joyous faces of the small family across from me, I couldn't help but think, I wonder if I have a camera somewhere in my inventory. Nah, with my memory, I would know if I did. That said, the gooey gushing emotions emanating from Minato and Kushina caused me to turn to Mito. "Isn't that great, Mito?" The girl in question tilted her head while still sitting on Minato's shoulder. "What is?" I looked back towards Minato and Kushina, who seemed to be in their own world. "It looks like your parents are going to get you a little sibling in the near future." Kushina and Minato froze. Mito smiled brightly. "I want a baby brother." She then turned towards her still parents' mommy. "Daddy! Can I have a brother?" she asked with shining eyes. Minato's face slightly burned up while Kushina glared at me, her hair writhing chaotically. "Yoru! What are you teaching my baby girl?" I tilted my head. "As far as she's concerned, a spork delivered her to you guys. I don't think she knows about the birds and the bee dash." For the first time in a while, my danger sense blared at me to move. Unfortunately, my movements were much too slow for me to dodge the chakra chain that tied around my ankle. My chakra was repressed. I was lifted up off the ground and hung upside down as Kushina brought me to her, a vein easily visible on her forehead. "You have some guts trying to corrupt my little girl." She then dangled me around with a sinister grin, say, "Your healing technique can regrow limbs, can't it?" While I was able to maintain a non-interested facade, my body's physiological response was hard to fake as cold sweat seeped down my forehead. Please, calm down dear," Minato said in a placating manner. Thankfully, Mito came to the rescue. "Birds?" she asked, causing Minato and Kushina to freeze. She looked at them innocently with her large blue eyes. "Is that where babies come from?" Minato sighed in relief while Kushina humphed and tossed me aside. "As far as you're concerned, young lady, it is." While Mito had a thoughtful look on her face, I did a backflip and perfectly stuck the landing. Kushina gave me another dirty look. I shrugged before pausing and sniffing the air. I looked at Kushina before pointing behind her. "I think you have more important issues than me to worry about." She froze, nose shifting before she panicked. "Oh no! My food!" She hurriedly moved to the pot and opened the lid, causing a plume of smoke to fill the house. She coughed while waving away the smoke before looking at the inside of the pot. "No! It's all burnt." Minato moved forward and placed his hands on her shoulders in comfort. "It's alright, we can always order something or eat out." Kushina's shoulders trembled before a shadow covered her face as she turned her head towards me. "Why are you?" And, "That's my cue to leave." I waved to them. "Well, enjoy each other's company tonight, though try not to keep Mito awake." Before they could even utter a retort, ID create, empty. I disappeared. Yoru, gamer. I exited my instant dungeon after entering my apartment and breathed a sigh of relief. I almost had to use second wind back there. With that thought complete, I looked around to see that everything was in place before nodding in satisfaction. I then reached into my inventory and pulled out a dull glowing orb. I could sense a large amount of energy contained within the minor beast essence as I carefully observed it at eye level. The energy certainly didn't feel like chakra, but instead kind of felt like some form of natural energy. "Oh well, I think she'll like it," I thought before putting it in my pocket and exiting my apartment building. I then took 5 steps forward towards the door across from me and raised my hand to knock on it. "Come in." I paused my motion before lowering my hand. I figured. And so, I opened the door and walked inside the apartment before stopping and blinking. There on the couch lay my teacher with a clone behind her who was methodically and carefully taking needles off her back. "Well, don't just stand there," she said as she motioned to me with her head, "Close the door and come over." I raised a brow and did as instructed before asking, "Acupuncture?" As the last needle was removed, the clone dispelled, allowing Koto to sit up and stretch her back. "I've been trying to relax ever since the war cooled down. Not being on missions for so long after having always been on so many of them has put me a little on edge." She then smirked, "I feel like I've been sleeping on pins and needles." She chuckled at that. I sighed, "Please stop, your puns prickle my ears." As soon as I said that, I raised my hand and snagged a long senbon from midair, catching it just a few centimeters away from my eye. I lowered my hand before twirling the long needle between my fingers. "That wasn't very nice." "Poof," she replied while leaning back on her couch with her legs crossed. "You'd be fine even if you let it hit you, but that aside." She looked at me questioningly. "As irresistible I may be, I doubt you came all this way to simply make fun of my bad puns." "I live 5 steps away." She rolled her eyes. "Semantics." I tossed the senbon back to my teacher, which she deftly caught, before replying, "I have something for you." She raised a brow before her gaze traveled to my pants pocket. "Is it whatever is in there?" she said as she pointed to it. Whatever you got there feels weird, but refreshing. Astute as ever. I said as I pulled out the minor beast essence and held it up to eye level. After fighting and killing a werewolf I dash. Wait. She said, holding her hands up before looking at me strangely. Did you say werewolf? I nodded. Her gaze became stranger. Where exactly did you find and kill a werewolf? Alternate dimension. She looked at me for a long time. You know what? I don't actually care. Continue. So, I did. After killing said werewolf, its body dissipated and I found this thing that looked like a chakra beast core but kind of felt different. I figured it worked the same, so I thought I would give it to you. Saying so, I handed her the lustrous orb of energy before commenting. I feel like I owed you that from the last time. Koto took the orb and observed it closely before chuckling. You're using me as a test dummy, aren't you? No. She gave me a humorous grin, yet she kept it anyway. I trust you wouldn't give me anything harmful. Her smile still on her face, but looked at me searchingly before asking, so? What else brought you over to my humble abode? I sat down next to her before laying the back of my head on her lap and looking up to the ceiling. Does a student need any reason to visit his favorite teacher? She looked at me with a raised brow. Oh yeah? I could have sworn you spent most of your time over at your other teacher's place. I guess my sense of time isn't what it used to be. She ran her fingers through my hair as she said so. Way out? I drawled slowly. That couldn't possibly be true, teacher. I guess you've really screwed up your perception of time because there's no way I would spend more time with Kushina and her adorable daughter than I would with you. She paused her caressing and tightly gripped my hair. Cheeky brat. Saying so, she pulled on my scalp. Ow. Please stop. She chuckled and did so. With that, I continued, besides, Kushina tried to kill me a few minutes ago, so you're back on top as my favorite teacher. So, I wasn't your favorite teacher before? You both were tied for the race. She gave me a humph before asking, so? What did you do to set the woman off? Well, it's kind of a long story. Trust me, I've got plenty of time. I paused. I'm also not sure I should be telling you this as the story contains information that I'm not sure I should share. Here, she looked at me skeptically. Were you specifically told not to tell anyone? I shook my head. I kind of escaped before any conversation of the sort could occur. Then spill. I paused then shrugged. Well, Minato was handed over the mantle of the Hokage and Kushina got quite excited due to that. I made fun of them for it and told Mito that she'd get a new sibling soon and Kushina got mad that I was teaching her daughter inappropriate things. Things escalated from there and here I am now. There was a pregnant silence that followed my statement before Koto stated, Minato's going to be the next Hokage? I nodded. Ha! She looked at me oddly. The things you go through in your free time, I really shouldn't bother asking. I shrugged. Anyway, I now have nothing else to do, so I'm here now. She tilted her head. What about your friends? Like that Itachi fellow you told me about. He's off on a mission. I simply replied. Then, what about that Rin girl? I'm sure she's grown up to be quite the cutie. I paused and narrowed my eyes. She's in a situation in which I can't really interact with her. The reason for that is an S-rank secret, but all I can say is that she's been asleep for a while. She gave me a long hard look and nodded in understanding before asking, what about Kakashi? He's been brooding every day since Obito died and goes to his grave like every other day. I can literally feel his depression from the other side of the village and it's really annoying. She rolled her eyes. Do you have any other friends? My teacher released a light sigh. You really need to get out more. She opened her eyes and looked at me, then. Are you just going to lay on my lap? I know they are comfortable, but I'm not going to sit here all day. I groaned slightly. Fine then, let's hang out with your friends. She paused. On second thought, I guess I really don't have much else to do either. Following that statement was a period of silence between us as Koto rubbed my head while I peacefully enjoyed it. Then I had a thought. Hey, remember that first mission we went to? After I had my first kill? She nodded. What about it? Well, I began, shifting my head to look up at her. Why don't we go to the hot springs as we did at that time? That's a very interesting way of introducing your proposal, she said before glancing upwards with a thoughtful look, but it doesn't sound too bad. However, she looked back down at me. Konoha doesn't have a mixed bath, so we'd have to be on the opposite sides of the fence. I scratched my chin and thought for a moment before I suddenly snapped my fingers. I can just make one. I nodded my head at the feasibility. I can manipulate the earth to dig a deep enough hole, then I can dump the water inside, but for the heating, I'd need to. I trailed off and thought for a moment as my mind ran through some calculations. Well, Koto said, looking at me. I refocused my gaze before sitting up from her comfortable lap and looking at her. I'm going to need that orb I gave you. She raised a brow and searched her pocket before handing it to me. You know, I never took you for the type of guy to take his gifts back. I would if I was upgrading it to something better, I said, looking at the orb appreciatively before nodding. Yeah, this will work. Are you going to tell me? Nope, you wouldn't understand anyway. She raised a brow and crossed her arms as she looked straight at me. Fine, but next time you want a lap pillow, don't come running to the one conveniently located across the hall. I closed my eyes and sighed before explaining. In order to produce the heat necessary for the hot spring effect, I need something that can conduct energy quite well, but I don't have anything like that in hand at the moment. However, this, I continued, holding the minor beast essence up, will work perfectly, and I'll be able to store a lot of my fire-natured chakra into it. I'll just have to create some seals to regulate the energy output once it is placed in the water, and I already have a design in mind. I trailed off in thought at the logistics of it before my teacher interrupted me. Fine, but where do you plan on building this hot spring of yours? I paused for a moment at the logical question before my brain came up with an answer. We'll use the 5th training ground. No one ever goes to the 5th training ground. She looked at me oddly. Where did you ever hear that? I looked back at her, from my own mouth. Koto stared at me for a long time before slowly taking a deep breath and sighing in exasperation. You know what? I don't even care. Saying so, she grabbed my wrist. Let's go. And without warning, she body flickered. Yoru, gamer. I placed my hand on the ground, spread out my chakra, and began to mold the ground beneath me. First, I cleared out an area 5 meters in diameter and only a meter in depth with my earth manipulation. I made sure that the ground was stable before I moved on to the next stage of my master plan. I spread out my chakra and felt for the various different kinds of stone littered beneath the soil. I closed my eyes in concentration for a moment as I sifted through the various types of stone before I gathered as much marble as I could. I sliced and shaped the marble into slabs with my earth manipulation and then began to place them along the sides and bottom of the makeshift pool. I used my earth-natured chakra to meld the stone together until the entire trench looked like it was composed of marble. I looked to Koto, who was sitting on the base of a tree a few meters away. Teacher, can you clean up the inside of that? I'm going to focus on the beast core for a moment. She shrugged and stood up. I got nothing better to do. Saying so, she went through some hand seals before blowing out a stream of water from her mouth into the pool. With that, she began to move and manipulate it around the marble-filled hole. Seeing as she was good on her end, I focused on mine. I took out a scroll and ink from my inventory and placed the chakra beast core to the side before I began hitting down seal formulas. Let's see, I can use 3.5 milliliters of ink and use 1.5 millimeters thick brush strokes. I nodded at the feasibility before I began to scribe. Energy storage matrix and a modulator to control its output in addition to a safeguard mechanism just in case I screw up with my final product. Whenever I was inventing a new seal, I first had to go through a rough draft on paper before I even began to think about implementing it with my chakra. If I screwed up on paper, as long as I wasn't working on spacetime seals, the worst that could happen is that it would blow up on my face. If I screwed up the seal with my chakra, considering it was much harder to get rid of than just paper and ink, let's not make that mistake. I don't want to find out the consequences. With my rough draft complete, I placed my hand on the piece of paper and input a little bit of chakra. My danger sense pinged, so I hurriedly tossed the scroll away, and no sooner did it explode in a shower of fire. I stroked my chin and thought, brush stroke width should go up by a millimeter, but the ink volume should be alright. Also, need to tweak a little bit of the storage matrix and output modulator. Should I be worried? Koto asked from the side with a raised brow. I broke myself from my thoughts and shook my head before getting back to work. Nope. This is all part of the natural Fuinjutsu seal life cycle. My teacher shook her head. You seal masters are insane. Saying her piece, she went back to cleaning the marble pool. I looked back at the ground and got out another scroll before inscribing the modifications to my seal. With that complete, I then placed my hands on it and emitted my fire-natured chakra. Immediately, I grabbed and tossed the scroll high up into the air, and no sooner did it burst into fireworks that lit up the late afternoon sky. Koto looked up from her working area. I don't suppose that was what you wanted to happen? Not quite. She rolled her eyes and continued on with her work. I rubbed my chin and calculated a few more things in my brain before I widened my eyes, a containment mechanism to prevent excess energy from leaking. How the hell did I miss that? After that epiphany, I furiously got to scribbling down my improvements before I finished. Okay, third time's the charm. I placed my hand on the paper and slowly infected my fire chakra within. Even after a while after, the scroll showed no signs of destabilization, causing me to smile in triumph. Alright, I'm all set. Koto stated from her end. Likewise. I stated before picking up the orb. Paper was not a great conductor of my energy and wouldn't be able to take in a large amount of it. So the fact that it had taken in as much as it did mean that my seal would be more than adequate for the minor beast essence. Along with that thought process, I used my chakra to form the completed seal on the orb. Afterward, I slowly infected my chakra, making sure to carefully watch for any signs of instability. When none was evident, I began to injections more and more of my fire-natured energy until a little more than a quarter of my energy had disappeared. It took in 500,000 units of chakra, sweet. With that, I looked to Koto, who was staring at me expectantly, and nodded. I walked to the center of the depression on the ground, opened up a small hole in the marble. I could feel the heat emanating from the orb in my hand, so I placed it in the small cavity I had created before stepping out of the hole. Next, I placed my hands on the ground and constructed a four-cornered wall around me and my teacher. Finally, I raised my hands and spread my chakra outwards before gathering as much water as I could. When I felt like I had gotten enough, I gently placed the giant ball of water into the empty pool. With that, I turned back to Koto, and that should do it. All we need to do now is wait for the water to heat up a little dash. Just shoot a fireball in the water. I really don't want to wait any longer. Your orb thing will keep the water warm. I blinked before turning around and doing as told and shooting a weak ball of fire into the water. Immediately after, light steam began to form, so I turned around back to my teacher only to see her already undressed. She smiled back at me. I told you, I really didn't want to wait. With that, she stepped into the pool and leaned back constantly on the sides of the makeshift bath. Ah, this feels so good. I shrugged and followed her inside. She looked at me oddly. You're coming in with your clothes on? After sitting down beside her, I removed my clothes with a thought. I usually just use the hinge to make my clothes. It takes way less effort to do that, to be honest. Wait. She said, turning towards me, you mean to say that you essentially walk around naked? How long have you been doing that? I waved my finger, First of all, I have clothes on, they are just not very durable since they are just energy constructs. As for how long? I paused and thought for a moment, 2 years, 5 months, 3 weeks, 2 days, 14 hodash. Okay, I get it. You have a perfect memory, sheesh. She said before resting her head back. You're the one who asked. I said before leaning back and enjoying the soak of the pool. Sometimes, it was simple things like this that felt the greatest. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket past going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.